Hello, everyone, and welcome to our class on the life of David. Today we are in Lesson 20 entitled David Returns. In our Bibles, we're going to be in 2 Samuel 19 and 20, 2 Samuel 23, and then also 1 Chronicles chapter 11, if you want to have your Bibles to look along and read along with us. As you've been through this study, you know that we don't do a verse-by-verse analysis of these chapters. This is more of just our look at these chapters, our commentary on what's going on here, providing some applicational thoughts as to what we've studied along the way. So the study is going to be much more beneficial if you're able to take the time and read through the chapters and to look at each of these verses and stories as you go along. In this lesson, we remember from our last study that David has crumbled. He's fallen apart. Absalom, his son, stole his kingdom, and then Absalom, his son, is dead. And that's the third child that David had to bury. The question to ask is, well, how do you pick up the pieces of a broken life? And it begins here for us in chapter 19 with Joab. Joab, who reminds David, there's a time to mourn, and there's a time that you need to have a brave face and to lead as a king. And David's mourning, carrying on in the mourning over Absalom, was causing Israel to mourn. It would have caused greater division had he continued on in the state. And so Joab rebukes him, tells him that he must stop if there's going to be peace in Israel, and David listens. And one thing he does as he returns as the king is that he starts to handle disputes. You know, the very thing that Absalom criticized David upon, that he doesn't hear you, he doesn't listen to you, he doesn't take your pleas, your cases. David does so. He proves that he has and continues to do so. So one of the things is he starts to handle disputes, and one of the first disputes happens to be Shimei. You remember Shimei? He was the one that, as David and his family was fleeing on the road, he was the one that was throwing rocks, kicking up dirt, hurling insults. Well, now that David is king, now his tune has changed. He's not insulting David anymore. No, he comes running. Verse 17 says, rushing before the king. And you notice what he says, verse 19. He admits his guilt and asks David to not remember the wrongs that he did. And then verse 20, he admitted that he had sinned. Well, David's friend and servant, Abishai, he's ready to enact judgment right there on the spot. He's a soldier. He's ready to kill him. But David shows him mercy. He shows Shimei mercy, and he says, in essence, there's been enough bloodshed, and that people have died, and no one's going to die today. What's interesting is that when his son Solomon becomes king, David tells Solomon about Shimei, almost as if David found a little loophole here, and that is, I'm not going to kill you today, but my son's going to put you to death. Well, then another case comes to David's attention, and that's with Mephibosheth. We remember his story. He's the son of Jonathan that David essentially just adopted as his own, took him in and blessed him with all the property and land that belonged to Saul and Jonathan. Well, when David was on the run, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, name's hard to say, he came running to David, and he came up with this accusation against Mephibosheth that he stayed in Jerusalem, essentially saying in verse 3, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me, as if he's this loyalist to Saul, and now it's back in the house of Saul. Well, in verse 4, David seemed to believe Ziba, and he gives the land of Mephibosheth to Ziba. Well, now David's back in Jerusalem, and here comes Mephibosheth, and we hear this side of the story. Mephibosheth comes, and he comes with this real unkempt appearance, which is a sign of mourning and grief. You want to look at Ezekiel 24 and verse 14, Micah 3 and verse 7. These kind of bodily unkempt appearance is a sign of great mourning and grief. And so the signs that you see here with Mephibosheth, the feet and the beard that were not kept, that were just a mess, that's not something you can produce at the last minute. That's not something you could do as soon as David just finds out that, or Mephibosheth finds out that David is victorious. That's something that's a product of time. Time to grow wild, unkempt. They're proof that Mephibosheth has been mourning this whole time. And so the true story from Mephibosheth's point of view is that Ziba has abandoned him, and he had no means of providing for himself. A way to travel in verse 26. He was left alone. He couldn't make it to David. And so Ziba had lied to David, but Mephibosheth, his greater concern is not about his land or his property. His greater concern in all of this is David's well-being, which tends to tell us that if you're going to take a side of the story, Mephibosheth seems to be the more compelling story here. In fact, you look at verse 28, what David had given Mephibosheth in his eyes, in Mephibosheth's eyes, was worth more than any of that property, was worth more than gold or land. He gave him a family, gave him home and hope. Well, David has heard both sides, and he just decides he's going to divide the land and split it between the two, and then be done. I'm done with it. He's done with the matter. There's a lesson there that when you handle disputes, there's always two sides to every story. There always is. There's also a time to be done. You know, I've heard from you. I've heard from you. Each of you has your point of view. We can't just go round and round and round. It's time to be done. We're going to make a decision and we're going to move on. And that's what David does. He doesn't call back in Ziba. He doesn't call for witnesses. He heard both sides and he says, you know what, I'm just going to move on. And where David erred here was on the side of grace. Someone was lying. Someone wasn't telling the truth, but both came out well on this deal. Because rather than one only having the land, both now have land, have property. And so David erred on the side of grace and mercy, and that is perhaps the side we ought to err on. If we don't know, it's better to err on the side of mercy and grace than to perhaps be too strict on a certain judgment. Well, chapter 19 ends, and David is going to Gilgal to complete his return as king and to be welcomed back as the king. And Judah, the tribe of Judah, is welcoming David back there in Gilgal. But this causes some friction. It causes a problem. Here's what one writer said about it. He says the northern tribes had been foremost in proposing the restoration, but owing no doubt to tribal jealousies, they had not been inviting the men of Judah to the gathering at Gilgal to welcome the king. Consequently, only a fraction of them, perhaps those from the immediate neighborhood and Transjordan country, were there. But while the king was still at Gilgal, the rest of the Israelite representatives arrived and complained to David that they had been unwarrantably forestalled by Judah and cheated of the honor and privilege of escorting him back. Tribal jealousy. There's Judah, who claims to have full rights to David. And then there's the rest of Israel, who claims to have the rights of David, because there's more of them. There's 10 tribes. There's more tribes there. And so some harsh words were said, verse 43, and tension begins to continue to build and to rise until a worthless man named Sheba from Benjamin just exploits and takes advantage of this opportunity, and he encourages men of Israel to turn away from David, turn aside from him. As David's only causing division, he's not worthy of your loyalty or support. Come with me. Let's defect from him. Well, one of the things that David does then to try and bring peace in this very hostile situation is that he chooses Amasa, appoints him as commander of his army, chapter 19, verse 13. This might also have been perhaps out of hurt feelings over Joab's actions with Abner and with Absalom. Don't know for sure, but perhaps he was motivated by that. What's interesting, though, is how David is reading the situation, because the unity of Israel was extremely fragile at this moment. The rebellion here follows so quickly after Absalom's rebellion, after his revolt. And without taking these next steps delicately, the hope of a restored, united Israel might have all been lost. And so Amasa is appointed as the commander of the army. Joab and the armies of Israel go to meet Amasa along the way. But while he's there, Joab strikes and kills Amasa, verses 9 through 11. I wonder why Joab seems so bloodthirsty. Why did he kill Amasa? In fact, you read in 2 Samuel 17, verse 25, Amasa and Joab were first cousins. It seems like close kinship was not a protection from Joab's malice. Well, it probably wasn't the wisest decision in terms of a relationship to be built and sustained between David and Joab. So perhaps it was not the wisest decision to appoint Amasa as commander over the army. But when you think about the relationship between Amasa and Joab, Amasa didn't do anything wrong to Joab. I mean, the only thing you might see here is that he just threatened Joab's role as commander. It was his job security. He threatened his role as the commander of David's army. And so Joab makes it look like an accident. He's just picking up his sword and it kills and he slays Amasa. It shows us, as we'll see here, I believe next week in one of our studies, just how very selfish and corrupt Joab could be. But really what he became, and just how very cold and calloused he was towards taking a person's life. Well, as Joab and the army pursues Sheba, he came to the city of Abel Beth Makkah, and they begin to besiege the city, verse 15. But then they're stopped. And of all people, they're stopped by this wise woman who comes out and she just simply asks, why are you wanting to hurt and destroy this peaceful city? And they tell her, look, we're looking for this guy. We're on a hunt for a man who is rebelling against the king. And the next thing you know, they're throwing Sheba's head over the wall to Joab. Here you go. If that's all it is, here you go. You see such a contrast here. The worthless fellow overcome by a wise woman. Okay, a very wise woman. And there's a lesson there. I mean, how many innocent people could have lost their lives had it not been for the wisdom of this woman to simply seek out the source of the conflict and to bring an end to it. She listened to Joab, she found the root of the problem, and they solved it. I think about that. How many times could we spare injury and harm, lashing out with our words and our actions, if we simply applied what James said, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Instead of just lashing out and fighting, if we just said, it seems like you're really mad. It seems like something's upsetting you. Tell me what's going on. What's the root of the problem? And in finding the root and determining what the root of the issue is, let's put an end to it. What is it? So often we just bicker and we fight. We don't even know what we're bickering and fighting about. Get to the root of the issue. Why are you mad? Why are you upset? Who hurt you? What was said? What was done? And what can we do to solve it? The wise woman spared the city because she listened. She listened to Joab. Be quick to listen. Be quick to listen. Slow to speak. Slow to anger. 2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11 tell us about David's mighty men. In fact, 1 Chronicles 11 verse 10 says, now these are the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who gave him strong support in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. They were close, loyal, brave warriors, soldiers who fought bravely for David. 37 in total, found down in verse 39. Here's a couple. Their names are hard to pronounce, so you got to forgive my pronunciation of them. But Joshabashebeth, verse 8, slew 800 at one time. And verses 13 to 17, 3 chief men, when David was thirsty, asking for water from a well in Bethlehem, they broke through the camp of the Philistines just to get him water. I mean, it just shows what love and devotion they have for David. If you're thirsty and you want this water, even though it's well protected, it's nothing to us. We'll risk our lives to get you this water, David. Abishai, we've heard a lot about him and his quick-tempered, his very fast response of taking a life. He was the one who in the cave said, hey, I can kill Saul. He won't even feel it. Be so fast. Be fast, quick, and easy. He was the one who, right here where Shimei, say the word, I'll take off his head. Abishai, verse 18, slew 300 in battle. Benaiah, verse 20, killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. Verse 21, killed an Egyptian with his own spear. And then it's the very last one. Verse 39 is Uriah the Hittite. It's one of David's mighty men. One of the things that we see from these men, just a neat section in and of itself, to read about the men who attach themselves to David, who are loyal to their king. One of the things you see is their loyalty, their fierce loyalty to their king. I maybe ought to ask the question, are we just as fiercely loyal and devoted to our king, to Christ? We are the soldiers of his army, Paul would say in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Are we just as loyal to our king as they were to David? I'm willing to go above and beyond, to stand behind you, to defend your name. Whatever it is that you ask, I'm willing to do it. These men sincerely loved David. Do we sincerely love our king? They were willing to do anything for him. And for one another, I think a lesson we see from the mighty men is there's a need to surround ourselves with good, strong friends, strong individuals. Hebrews 3 and verse 13 says, encourage one another day after day, so long as it's still called today, lest anyone be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And so one of the ways that we combat the daily discouragement, the temptations we face on a day-by-day level, and not sink into those temptations and to drift into sin, one of the ways God has given us to combat those daily temptations is each other, strong brothers and sisters. And the encouragement there is not be encouraged by your brethren. The encouragement there is go encourage. Encourage one another day by day. Reach out to one another. Here's the thing. If you're watching this today, right, this is August the 13th of 2020. This was written in a time when Christians were being persecuted by Jews. And it wasn't shortly after that they were strongly persecuted by the Roman government. And so they were living in incredibly chaotic and troublesome times. And they didn't have smartphones. They didn't have Facebook. They didn't have email. They didn't have the means by which they could just send a quick message, an instant message to people on the same day. And yet, in the midst of that incredibly difficult time, the writer says, encourage one another day after day. Encourage each other every day. Make sure every day you're reaching out to your family in Christ and you're encouraging them. Why? Because every day Satan's battling for their souls as much as he's battling for yours. And it's hard. It's hard to remain faithful. It's hard sometimes to continue to remain true. The daily struggle of remaining steadfast and loyal to Christ, of overcoming discouragement and doubt and fears, it's hard. It's hard. In fact, sometimes it's harder on some than others. And so make sure you're doing your part to strengthen those around you. Do you think we need that today? Do you think that encouragement means anything for us today? Do you think you know anyone in your church family who's facing some hard times, some discouragement, some loneliness, having been socially distanced? Is there something you can do about it? Can you find a way every day, even if it's just one soul, to reach out with a simple message, maybe by a text message or a Facebook message or an email or a phone call? Just want you to know I love you. I'm thinking about you. I'm saying a prayer for you this very minute. Have a wonderful day and stay true to Christ. I read this passage today and I wanted you to think about it and share this encouraging passage. How easy is that? And yet how powerful and empowering that is when you receive those messages. My brethren are thinking about me and they're praying for me. And they're encouraging me to be steadfast. They are telling me that they believe in me and that I can do it. And so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. David surrounded himself with great men. Men who made him better. Men who he made better. And we need those kind of relationships in our lives to be an example and those who are an example to us. Strong individuals who help us be strong in return. You know, throughout his life, David had a lot of supporters and a lot of friends. And, you know, a question to ask, and maybe you can think on this, is what was it about David that made him so appealing, so attractive, that made people just attach themselves onto him? There's a lot we could probably pull out. I mean, he was a natural leader. He was a leader when he was a young kid facing off against Goliath. He's always been a leader. He was confident. He was brave. He was strong. He inspired the best in others. When Saul only inspired fear, David was inspiring courage and bravery in the Lord. Perhaps what attached people to him was the fact that he had a genuine love for God, and that was just contagious. How much he loved God and depended on God and leaned on God in some really hard and difficult times, but he continued to place his trust and his loyalty in the Lord, and that made a tremendous difference in the lives of others. And I think you can make the point, David had a lot of good friends because he was a good friend. He was a good friend. No, he wasn't the perfect friend to some, but he was a good friend to those he had in his lives. And we need to be good friends too. So as we end our lesson today, hope you'll come back and join us again for our future studies. But I want to end with this encouragement. Can you find someone to reach out to and encourage? Can you find a brother or sister in Christ that you can be a strong supporter to? That you can take a moment today, if you've not done so, or even if you have, just maybe one more time. Find someone that you can spend just a minute, write out a nice, thoughtful message. Just say, hey, I was thinking about you, and I was praying for you. I'm thankful to God for you. Keep walking close with Christ, brother. Keep on doing those great works, sister. I believe in you, and I know God believes in you too. What a difference. What a difference I can make. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope this has been helpful to you. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to you studying with us again soon. Take care.